Hello, and welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and a software developer at Axonic, Sara. In this episode, I spoke with Misha Makara of Mindsea about an application he and his team helped design and develop called Hire. Hire helps individuals find temporary shift work in the field of hospitality. The choice to implement DDD, CQRS, and event sourcing was a clear one from the start for Misha and his team, as they knew how complex some of these issues that they were trying to solve would be and how much they needed to rely on a message-driven architecture. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Misha, and let's have a listen. Hey, Misha, how are you doing today? Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for agreeing to talk about some really cool stuff today. I'm really excited to hear all about it. But before we start with our topic, can you tell everybody about where you are, who you are, what do you do, just whatever you like to share?
Sure. So my name's Misha Makara, and I right now work for a diversity-focused venture capital group out of New York called Angels. And specifically, I do technical due diligence on portfolio companies, and I help usually companies that are in trouble, but every once in a while a company that's doing just fine with designing enterprise systems that are scalable and very secure.
That sounds very formal, but also very... And from briefly knowing you, that sounds really formal. Yeah, great. So I can't wait to hear more about it, actually.
Okay.
But
yeah, so you want to pry into.
That's great. So you mentioned you help these businesses grow and to sort of also grow their products and things, which is, I think, a very interesting topic to possibly get into. But you do work for a company called Mindsea. Is that correct? Or is that...
So Mindsea is one of the companies that's part of the Angels Venture Capital Group. And they're a web development company that's out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. And they are doing a lot of work with domain-driven design and event-sourced frameworks for their applications.
Okay, great. Which is exactly where I wanted to land in. So thank you for making it so easy
for me to ask the next question. Right?
It's like you read my mind. This is great. So tell me a little bit about domain-driven design and event sourcing. And I know you've worked with CQRS as well. So how did you come about to know some of these terms and patterns and things like that? And what got you really interested about them?
Yeah, that's a wonderfully framed question, especially considering the company that we're talking about today. So one of the companies that is part of the portfolio is called Hire, and that is a company that helps individuals find temporary shift work. And so I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that today.
Yes, we will.
Yeah, go figure. And so that was my intro into it. But then since then, it's expanded in a bunch of different directions. And Mindsea, we especially love it for the projects that we're working on, which tend to be highly regulated. We need to make sure that we've got consistent audit trails. We need to make sure that the data is immutable. So, of course, event-sourced frameworks and domain-driven designs are incredibly powerful to be able to solve those kinds of problems.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about Hire. So you mentioned it's good for folks who want to work certain shifts. So this is in hospitality, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about what Hire is and what they do and kind of how things came about. Perfect. So this is, of course, pre-pandemic, and pandemic, it became even more important. But the whole thing behind Hire is it started with the CEO, Josh. He was sitting down at a restaurant and the server came over and said, hey, I'm sorry, we're a little short staffed today. And at the time he was working for a hotel and going, I've got these extra staff. And, I wish there was a way that we could easily have people find and pick up shifts based on, the skill sets that they have and, people already being trained. So Hire is an application that does exactly that. So you can kind of think of it as Tinder for a business to help businesses find and hire temporary shift work. So if you're a restaurant and you need a bartender for the evening, you can go post a shift for a bartender. You can specify the experience level and the kinds of skills that you're looking for. A bunch of people can then go apply. The business gets notified when people apply. and then they can go through those profiles literally Tinder style and swipe up and down to say what they like or dislike. And the people that they hire then get invited to go work that shift. Everything's taken care of in application, and people get paid out and reviewed in both directions. So the company reviews the worker reviews the company, and on top of that, we also have these portable benefits called U days. So as you work in the platform more and more, you get credit towards taking time off. So it's
that's really nice.
Platform.
Yeah, it's funny that you were mentioning Tinder, and in my mind, when you talked about Hire, I was thinking of this babysitting app that we used to use, and that was very similar. I guess based on your life experience, right? It just translates into different things, but that's really cool. Okay. And right. There's a lot of these apps that are coming up, which is really nice because in hospitality business, especially, it's sometimes really difficult to find folks who are really reliable sometimes, and sometimes it's kind of flipped the other way around too, because you are let's say a server or you're a bartender, you really need work, but you can't really find something that suits your hours. And sometimes, I don't know, you have 3 different jobs, like exactly. I did back in college, and you don't need an 8 to 5, you need like a 10 to 12 kind of shift or something like that.
That's how this works. So you can say, hey, I just want to pick up some extra work to go pay my rent. You can go look in this application, see all the shifts that are happening around you. Just go and apply. We also, which is pretty interesting, encourage businesses to hire people off the platform for full-time work, and we don't charge any fees or anything to do that. So we would love to hear stories about that, about how companies are using this application and platform in order to try workers out before they go hire them. And we, of course, provide the insurance and everything that goes along with that.
That's really cool. That's very interesting. I have a million questions about the app, but yeah.
That's a topic for another one.
That's another topic. But yeah, anyways. But I want to actually focus a little bit more on CQRS. So for Hire, you decided that you wanted to basically separate these commands and queries and then event source. So what was the thought process behind that? I know you wanted to scale, and that, of course, kind of allows you to do more and it's more powerful. But can you walk me through a little bit of the decision-making part of it?
Yeah, so let's talk about it. So this particular company, when I first started working with them, had an application that was a traditional CRUD application, and there were a bunch of problems that came along with that. For starters, the app was very slow. It was very difficult to go find workers, and we'll talk a lot about the state model and the problems that CQRS solved there. But a simple answer here is that we wanted an application that was able to handle an Uber level of business. So we wanted to be able to handle hundreds of thousands of shifts going on all around the planet that needed to be able to work in different kinds of localities with different laws and minimum wages and things applied to it. We also wanted to be able to have a lot of control over the data to be able to make better decisions and recommendations and to manage risk. And so specifically CQRS, it was kind of a no-brainer when we were looking at it in terms of our options and different ways to rebuild the application.
Okay. So you mentioned that this application existed before, and then you decided that, hey, this is not working for us. Let's change it and let's redesign some things. So was it a monolithic application in the beginning, and then you decided, hey, let's come out of the dark ages and do a little bit different?
There's not, sometimes monoliths are the way to go, especially when you're creating a product and trying to demonstrate market traction. But given the needs for scale here, that wasn't going to cut it. And when we were looking specifically at how to make it more performant, we realized that there were just some things about how the application was constructed that were going to be no-go items as part of the legacy design.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely, I agree. One of the things that we a lot of times recommend is start with a monolith, and as your application grows and your requirements change, then you can think about taking things out and
putting them into modules and or different applications altogether and so forth, which is always helpful. So in your particular case, so you mentioned that there was the issue of the application being really slow, and another issue of, okay, so if we want to make this application more of an international application where you can work with different really requirements, different laws, different tax requirements, different minimum wages and things like that. Did you have to, I guess what I'm really curious about finding out is that, how did you start that process? Did you maybe first started in the States and say, okay, let's work with different states first in the United States, and then grow it more internationally? Or did you just...
Yeah, so we started off in New York City, and then very quickly launched also in Toronto, and
Okay.
that was pretty easy. So even being able to identify users as being in the U.S. or Canada, we could look at the prefix of their phone number to make a determination.
Right.
But being in a global world, we had people that were switching different regions and localities, and so even there, the international boundary quickly became a problem. And then we wanted to do business in New Jersey, which sounds like an easy thing, except that New Jersey has different wages and different laws and different things going on. But at the same time, a person in New York City should be able to work a shift in New Jersey. If they
driving
want to.
distance.
Easy. Yeah. So, but how do you enforce these different rules? How do you enforce these different regulations? On top of that, Canada has different liquor laws. Right. So there's other certifications that you are legally required to have in order to be able to serve liquor in Canada. How do you enforce that for both the organization and the individual? And then how do you do it for certain kinds of work that are kind of ambiguous? So how do you make sure that you're following the law and with regard to those certifications, with regard to those minimum wages that you have to make sure that the worker is always getting paid above? And it gets more and more complicated the more that you look at it with all of these edge cases and corner cases. So how do you deal with a worker that's being hired to go put up flyers, that's going to work between different regions? It's very, very complicated.
Very complex. Yeah. So going back to the process of decision making, I think that's always very interesting to me, because you, of course, when you either build an application or if you want to improve an application, you have certain goals in mind. You want to expand it in X, Y, and Z regions, and you may not come to really know all of these edge cases ahead of time. Going into the design, do you have a design session that you do with the architects and so forth? And how do you basically, do you know all of the questions ahead of time? Do you basically put them together, or do you just kind of sit down together and do a, I don't know, event storming session or something like that?
So we definitely did event storming. Another tool that we did on top of that was we did service blueprinting. So event storming, we like to talk about the different actors in the system and the major events and commands and aggregates and all of that good stuff. There's this great companion to that activity, which is diagramming the different lines of visibility between each of the different business units. Which, if you're coming at it from a CTO standpoint, is really helpful, because when you're especially trying to create a new business, it's always about the union between people, process, and technology. And so you're trying to use technology to create an experience. So you have to start by designing that experience. If you don't start there, then you're making your customers be the victim of that technology rather than using the technology as an enabler. So we started with service blueprinting before we even got into your traditional DDD activities. With that, we were able to start to map out what are some of the different performance reporting things that we needed, the KPIs, all of that good stuff, and of course the communications that would be required. So after we did that, we then went into your traditional event storming. We were fortunate enough in this particular application, in this particular case, to have an existing application we could point to, where we knew that there were large gaps in terms of functionality that we could spend more time talking about. And then off of that, we could continue into the regular development processes from there.
So I have two questions on that. One, which I guess a broader question, and then one a little bit more specific. So the first one, within your team, did you have to do a lot of training for the architects, engineers, designers to become familiar with these patterns, such as DDD and even event storming? Did they know about it ahead of time, or did you have to do a lot of training for the team itself?
We ended up having to do training, and this is where Axon is great, because there's a lot of existing pre-built materials and things that you can use and point to in examples. Also, we did send several people to the Axon Fundamentals Boot Camp, the 3-day
nice.
which is helpful.
Oh, this was back in the day when we did them in person. This was pre-COVID.
Yeah, this is a while ago. So that was very, very helpful. But there's a lot of those materials that still exist online that are useful. And in terms of facilitation of this, first, again, the whole idea is that this is a top-down approach. We're creating a new product and a new experience, so that the swim lane diagrams were very helpful to talk about. What do we want the worker to see? What do we want the business to see? What do we want to see from an administration standpoint? And then putting all of those things together. Beyond that, then we went into the actual domain-driven design, and it's very helpful to have a facilitator that can be the one to enforce the vocabulary, to make sure that stickies aren't getting put up with the wrong colors, or to say, actually, there's a lot of stuff in this one. Let's talk about breaking this one apart a little bit more. But everyone can participate in DDD. Even non-technical people can say, this is in the wrong order, or how do you handle this, or just ask questions that can add an incredible amount of value to the session.
Yeah. And I think that's a preference in a lot of companies as well, because the whole point of DDD is to answer a business question, right? So you want your business folks there to maybe guide through some of the decision making and so forth as well. So that was the case with this application, correct?
Exactly. And again, the nice compatibility with the swim lane stuff is that we had started with sequencing the large blocks before we went into our wall of stickies. So we were all making sure that we were telling the same story.
That's really great. And it's good that you could do it in person at the time, and that everybody can kind of come to the same room and exchange ideas and put sticky notes there. Now we do them virtually. Hopefully we go back and do them in person again, which is what I'm looking forward to. So the other question that I had, which was a little bit more, I suppose, technical. So you mentioned within this previous application, or the I guess mother application that you had, and then you wanted to go more into distributed systems. Did you have to redesign everything, or did you have a well-structured set of APIs that you could basically use in order to set things apart and pull it apart and modularize it, basically?
Yeah, so in this particular example, we started with the monolith, and there were definitely large blocks of functionality that could be broken apart into smaller services. So for example, notifications, right? We were using an external email provider, and templates and things like that can all be migrated over. That's not the reason to do this. But we did want to be able to have longitudinal visibility about what happened to that user, what was their experience, and that's where the event sourcing becomes incredibly valuable. So the sending out the email, not the sexiest thing. The ability to layer in that data to construct a larger narrative about what happened to this person, what was their interaction with the business, that's where this framework was incredibly helpful to us.
Nice. So then I'd have to ask, so you mentioned that you found Axon framework and you started working with it. So how did you come across it? Were you just looking for something that could work within CQRS, and this came up?
Well, we actually did some performance testing, and we're very impressed with Axon's performance. Nice. But that's also a topic for another day. No, but specifically the issue that we were running into was around that state model, and we can. If you want, we can spend some time.
Tell me more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell me more. There was a teaser before.
Tell me everything.
So here's the underlying problem. So first of all, we wanted to get an application out the door quickly, and we didn't know what kind of data was going to be valuable to us. So let's talk through this as a scenario. So first of all, the talent, the worker, goes and applies to a shift. Well, obviously, that's an event. We want to know. We'll skip over all the application stuff, but there's a bunch of nuggets of goodness in there too. What was interesting was what happens when this worker is even getting queued up to go work for this shift. So first, there's a lot of signals that are given to us from the worker that can start to raise our company's interest in set off some alarms about whether or not they're going to be able to make it to this shift. Mm-hmm. So obviously there's GPS data, but there's also other signals that we can look at about, did they open the email? Did they respond to the text? Those are things that are specific to that particular shift, but there's also other bits of data that we have historically. Have they canceled previously? Have they worked shifts previously? So all of that is good information for us to take into account about, is this worker going to cancel? And obviously, if they cancel, that's a problem, right? The business was expecting that worker to show up. And the whole point of this was, the business wanted a bartender at 6 o'clock, and they want to know that that bartender is going to be there. So first of all, we handle it with some product things, right? We mark cancellations and we, give the worker a slap on the wrist. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about how did we get around this nasty, nasty state model. And so to do this with a traditional state model, how would you do that, right? You've got all of these different things. So what happens if you see that the worker opened the email, but, is not sending us GPS data? Or what if they are sending us GPS data, but we know that they've been able to make fast connections and commutes before? Mm-hmm. So the hugest advantage for us and the major selling point for rebuilding the innards of the application here was that we didn't have to make that state model. So let's play that story forward a little bit more. Something that looks as simple as the check-in. So check-in is obviously important because that determines, when are we going to start paying them. A lot of weird things can happen. The worker could not click the button. The worker could not enter into the Geo Fence. The employer could say that the worker wasn't there. There's all kinds of weird things that can happen. And for each one of these different permutations and combinations, you'd have to make a state model and you'd have to create different rules around it. So the event sourcing framework got us away from all of that and allowed us to layer on different rules and different interpretations based on what the interpretation was at that particular point in time. So if the business has a good track record and, we've got a lot of shifts with them, we can round in favor of the business. Right. If the worker has a bunch of, cancellations, maybe that's a good indication to round in favor of the business again. Right. If the workers worked several hundred shifts across different businesses and this business has just started and the worker has a great review, probably we should round in favor of the worker, right? So there's all kinds of things that we can get away from that we would have to do a lot of things to figure out in a traditional CRUD application that in event sourcing make it really easy. We can look at those things, we can define different weights, and then we can make an informed decision as a result. The same thing, all of those things that I just mentioned just get doubled again when we're talking about checkout. The worker forgets to check out. The business, has a different checkout time than what the worker said. Again, the worker isn't sending us geodata. Again, all of those things get massively simplified by using this particular framework.
So a question that kind of has nothing to do with the wonderful explanation you just provided. Just curious. So does the worker use a different application than the business does?
No. One of the things that's really unique about Hire is that the business and the worker all use the same application, and a worker can switch from being a worker in one context to being a business in another. They can literally change inside the app, the colors change and all of that. But you can go from being a worker to being a business just by going under the little profile and switching to
switching it.
Yep.
That's pretty cool. That's really nice. So you mentioned the word context. in that case, are we talking about bounded context, or are we just talking about different context?
That's not a bounded
maybe
context.
both a little bit.
Nice try. No, this is an MBA context. This is not a bounded context. So the bounded, like, obviously, with these frameworks, the answer is very frequently it depends.
Exactly.
So when we're looking at it under the lens of determining what the check-in time is, how do we pay this worker? What I meant was that there's different rules that we can apply based on that worker or that industry or that locality in order to be able to determine when do we start paying that person. So, and again, all of that gets doubled again for checkout, right? So it's one of those things that on the surface sounds really easy, but when you start to think about check-in, checkout, it gets nasty quick.
That's really interesting, because a lot of times when we talk about I don't know, in particular for Axon framework, the use cases, a lot of times you're running into certain businesses like fintech or even healthcare in some areas. And this is one of, I would say, more interesting use cases, in my opinion, because I was in the hospitality work field long time ago. And back then you would either have a check-in, check-out card, or you just go on the computer and just punch in your number, whatever. But then it stayed in the system, which was the business's system. So you as a worker didn't really have any say in it. Basically, you didn't have any control over anything. You just go into their system and enter. So this is interesting, and this is something that I hadn't thought about. But yes, it's absolutely valid, because you're entering something in one application on your end, and then the business is entering something else. So then how do you deal with it? So talking about all of these different edge cases and different scenarios, how do you then think about the future of this application? And I'm not just talking about the growth of the application, but also some of these edge cases that might come up. Do you then go back to the drawing board and bring in the whole team and say, okay, how do we deal with this really complex, difficult situation, or how can we avoid it in the future?
Yeah, so I kind of layered it into the story previously, but the Geo Fencing is a newer feature.
Yeah.
Right? So it's another data point that's used to make the determination about, first of all, did this person actually work or not? And
it's
when
kind of a lie detector in a way, right?
Yeah. So that's another interesting thing about this particular application. The vast majority of people are good and are trying to do the right thing, but when you get a bad one, they are really, really trying to game the system. And how do you deal with that? How do you make sure that you've got enough data before you block them and you potentially get rid of a user that could otherwise add a lot of value to both the employers and be a participating part of the community. So in terms of layering on and adding additional things, just to follow the story of the Polygon, that was an interesting idea that came from one of the organizations that we work with. We can define our Polygon around that space and say, all right, when they enter in, that's another data point that we can use to make a determination about when do we start the clock for paying that particular worker. So even if they don't click the check-in button and the employer doesn't click the check-in button, we at least have some data to be able to make a decision about when do we start the payment. Another thing I didn't talk about was the payments here are perhaps more important than I emphasized. We do payouts for the worker within 24 hours.
Oh, wow.
So there's often not enough time to be able to go to the business or to talk to them or to have the business engage. They finish a shift at 2 a.m. Those people don't even think to look at their phones and they go home. We've already started to collect that data and figure out how much are we going to pay these people. And there's a credit card involved, and oftentimes these businesses run really tight limits on their credit card. So how do you deal with these payment edge cases where there's not the available capacity on the card? And you might be screaming at home, oh yeah, there's a pre-auth, just use a pre-auth. Yeah, businesses don't like it when you pre-auth, a lot more than you need, especially when, they're a retailer and they're running their credit limits really tight. So, again, it's a very interesting problem. So event sourcing allowed us to go layer on, in this particular case, this Polygon and use that as another data point. And But even then, that's not the end of the story, because you do have some shift work that are, people doing pop-up things, or they're not working at the location that they said they were going to work at. And that's fine, because they're going around and they're, putting up signage, or they're talking to people, or they're handing out cards. And in fact, you want them to be outside the polygon. So then you have these other situations where you have to say, all right, for this particular kind of work, we're going to place less emphasis on the polygon. Or for this particular employer, for this particular thing, we're going to place less emphasis on this polygon. Mm-hmm. So again, event sourcing allows us to get away from a lot of those problems and, the exponential complexity that gets added on that you'd have to do in the state machine or state model.
Yeah, I can even imagine how many, I don't know, complex situations you come across, especially as you're expanding and you're dealing now with not just payments or people checking in and checking out, which seem to be on the easier side of things in a way, because we're talking, on the other hand, you're expanding internationally and you have to deal with different tax laws and different employment laws and different, I don't know, different ways of payments. So as you go and expand, like, what do you do?
Yeah,
right,
exactly. What do you do with the worker that, again, we never ask them what region are they working in, right? All of that is defined based on where where the actual work is happening. So yeah, having the ability to have the same application, the same user being able to, work a shift in New York, hop on a flight, go to Toronto, open their application, and then go pick up a shift later that same day. That's quite powerful. And
that's really great.
A lot of things that have to be interpreted in order to make that magic happen.
Yeah, that's amazing. This is so wonderful because, again, going back to my personal experience being in hospitality and sometimes needing that extra couple of hours just for whatever reason, you have time, or you need to, I don't know, buy a textbook in college, which costs probably half of your month's paycheck.
Well, there's also all kinds of magic about making sure that if you have back-to-back shifts, that there's enough space in between to be able to make it from one to another.
To drive there, or,
all of the bike there, whatever. And things that go on with that. There's a whole other set of things complexities that you have to think about there.
Yeah.
Right. So being able to layer in data from Google Maps about where does one shift end and where does the other one begin, and is there enough time for them to make that commute during that particular time of the day? Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this makes a very interesting design session for you guys working on the application on a regular basis. You're like, oh, how do we deal with this thing now? Right.
Well, frankly, it's not so bad, right? Because, we spent the time at the beginning doing
which is very important. Yeah.
So when we find that there's another factor that needs to get layered in for something like, how long did they work the shift? It's really not so bad, right? We just have to figure out, what does the business want to do, which frankly should be the biggest problem, right? The biggest problem should be the product design and figuring out what's going to work for the people, not doing the actual coding. So there's a lot more work that we had to do up front about designing the system and making sure that we got it right. But that design has paid dividends in terms of being able to support at one point hundreds of thousands of shifts when we had a national activation for a particular retailer that they hired all of these workers simultaneously, which, by the way, was an interesting morning because I didn't know that we had done that. And I was looking at our server load, and I was like, oh, someone must have done a bad push. Things seem to not be very efficient. And I looked at our admin panel. I was like, oh no,
look at all these people.
Seems like we're doing a thing. And then the CEO called me. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you we're doing a thing. It's like, great.
Surprise.
That's cool. Well, but we didn't actually have to do anything. I was expecting
it did well. Yeah.
Spin up some more servers or to do something, but no, because everything was just sitting in queue. We had designed an application that could handle some server delays, and no one noticed a thing because everything just gets put in a queue and it gets handled when it gets handled. So
that's really amazing.
Not even a problem.
And I think that comes back to what you mentioned, spending a lot of time designing it and thinking ahead and seeing what can happen and how can you prevent a lot of disasters in the future, which is really, I think, something that sometimes gets overlooked. And I'm a huge believer of really spending the time ahead of time as opposed to then going and patching things in the future. So that's really great to hear. Wow, really wonderful. So any other points that you want to share about this application or your process or anything that I
just
didn't add?
so specifically for Mindsea, building applications like these, we've really taken a fondness to Axon. One of the things that we didn't need to use in this particular application that we've been using in several projects now has been the encryption of the underlying events. And that can be especially fun if you've got different localities. You're dealing with patients in the US and Canada, and they've got different laws and different residency requirements. So being able to encrypt those things and make sure that they end up in the right region has been an interesting problem for us that we're thankful for our partnership with Axon for being able to help us and manage those things. But in terms of our process, usually what we like to do as an organization and what I like to do as a facilitator is, we sit down, we make sure that we understand, the customer, what the business case is, all of that good stuff. Then we, of course, do our mock-ups, and simultaneously we'll do that swim lane diagram, our service blueprint. And off of that, that's where we usually then start to jump into our domain-driven design and actually mapping out all of the different commands and events and aggregates and bounded context, all that good stuff, all your sticky time. And you mentioned before being able to do it on a whiteboard. I've really been enjoying being able to do it digitally and not having to worry about bumping into the wall. So that's one thing.
Has its benefits, right?
And so then from there, we love to do proof of concept tests to make sure that these ideas and things are viable, and then
actually working,
estimating and jumping into development. So even though we've talked about this under the context of hire, being able to do it for large applications that have multinational requirements and very strict data residency rules and unknown reporting requirements, which is another topic of it's been very helpful. We didn't know the reports that we needed to create at the beginning of this. Being able to have an event-based system has been incredible for being able to define those reports later on rather than at the beginning phase of the project when you're still fighting through in traditional stuff, your schema design and your data types. So another little hidden benefit that we didn't quite expect that's been huge for us.
That's amazing. That's really great. And hopefully these hidden benefits pop up in the future too and make your life easier, which is great, right? That's all about,
clients never change their minds. Businesses never change their minds.
Of course not. No, never. That's unheard of. Of course. Of course not. Make it super easy for you, right?
Try my best.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Misha, for sharing all of this amazing process that you and your team have gone through, and just being available to tell the story and talk about some of the challenges that you had, as well as some of the really great success that you've had with Hire and in general with other projects that you've worked on. So hopefully we'll come back and talk about another project of yours in the future, and I really look forward to that. But again, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Have a great day. Talk to you soon.
I hope you enjoyed my talk with Misha. Please join me next time as I discover other fascinating topics with wonderful guests. Until then, have a great time and happy coding!